Jimmy in Saigon is a documentary that you have just got to see. Peter McDowell sets to find out what really happened to his brother when he died over 40 years ago. The film premieres September 28th at the Reeling Film Festival. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So you're coming to Chicago, you're doing a Q&A, you're introducing the film. Let's talk a little bit. I mean, you guys grew up in the Champaign area. You worked in Chicago for a little bit, which we'll get to a little bit later. But let's first talk a little bit about the film and your brother's journey from Champaign to end up in Saigon.
Yeah, well, I'm the youngest of six children, and my brother was the eldest. So he was born in 1948 in Champaign, Illinois. My father was a music professor, and my mom was also an alum of University of Illinois. So I grew up in Central Illinois. I was the youngest, born in 1967, so I was almost 20 years younger than him. He went to Vietnam in 1970 in the Army, and really loved it. He finished his tour of duty in the Army, came back to the United States, and returned almost immediately as a civilian to Vietnam, which was very unusual at the time, 1971. And a year later, he was suddenly and mysteriously dead. And that was when I was 5 years old. So I didn't know that much about him. I kind of learned gradually bits and pieces from my family, and that's kind of what the film is about. I started making it 12 years ago, and I decided to try to interview everybody that ever knew him. I traveled the world, went all over the US and France, and I went to Vietnam twice, and found out a lot of the answers I was looking for.
I mean, it was a painful memory. You addressed it in the film as far as like anytime you would ask a family member that people didn't want to talk about it. And finally, it was like, when's ever going to be the right time? Why was it important for you to share his story in this way?
I mean, I think because I was the youngest, I didn't really know him the way other people did, and I felt that he was just this huge gap in my life. And there was a a moment where my mom had said to me years ago something indicating that she was not completely sure about his sexuality. And I thought I was the only gay kid in the family, so I kind of had to like do some research to see what I could find out about that. Because as I say in the film, sometimes it's kind of lonely to be the only gay kid in a large straight Catholic Roman Catholic family. And so I was really pretty motivated, and it wasn't just the sexuality, it was just like trying to figure out who he was in his life and not just in his death.
I mean, because even when you talk about, I mean, let's just go back to that time period when your brother was a teenager, when you were growing up. There was the draft. There was no LGBTQI plus characters on television, no celebrity relationships that people followed along, and it was tough to be out at that time. And there really were no role models that people could say like, well, one day this is going to be me, or one day I can see myself, being
Right.
XYZ. I mean, it was just such a very difficult time for so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think he felt some freedom in being in another country, and I think that this is a common story that was told like in at that time in history, like really in the 20th century. I think 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, a lot of people went to other countries to explore their personal life or their sexuality because they kind of had to like break free from the bonds of whatever country they came from. And well, I don't think Vietnam was progressive in terms of its view of sexuality. It was also kind of turned its other way. It's had the other way, or it wasn't like a big issue. It didn't have this sort of Puritan, um, you know, Catholic Puritan guilt shame thing that we have here.
Let's talk a little bit about you setting out to do this project. You mentioned 12 years ago is when you started, because you could have gotten the answers you were looking for, no answers at all, or answers that you were not expecting to have. I mean, did you go in there with expectations, or were you just like, I'm just going to see what I end up finding out and try to reach out to as many people as possible?
Well, there's a couple different ways of making documentaries. You can either kind of like script the whole thing in terms of what you plan, and of course it'll change, or you can just start. And I did the just start thing. I bought a camera and sound equipment. I bought a used camera. I used all the rest of my money that I had in 2010 when I started, used a HD camera and some sound equipment, and I just tried to meet with as many people as possible and sort of craft the story that way. And over the course of years, discoveries that we made helped us get closer and closer to a final story that we could tell to people. And the story is different than what I thought it was going to be, because I really didn't think that my story would be such an important part of it. I thought it would be mostly just about my brother. But as I worked together with our editors and our producers, they felt pretty strongly that I had to kind of center my narrative, and even we had to contextualize the era, which is something that I didn't really think. I kind of assumed everybody knew about the Vietnam War and that period of history, but we really had to contextualize that in the film.
You talk about you just talked about your coming out, and what was it like? Because in the film we hear that we see that your dad was more accepting than your mom, initially, and she's had a change of heart, which we get to to see shortly thereafter. But in that time, a lot of times people come out and their mom is usually more accepting than their dad, and your family was a little bit more of the reverse.
Yeah, I mean, I think my mom always says, my mom's still alive. She's 98. My dad passed away at age 93, but she always used to say that my dad had a very singular focus. He was really interested in his career and in music, and everything else really didn't matter. And so for him, it was a matter of like, it just didn't, rate as something that was a problem for him. He didn't have that sort of, um, he didn't have like a really staunch religious upbringing, which I think my mom did. And my mom has become a really progressive. She's still, sort of Catholic, but she's just very progressive.
We get to see that your brother had a special relationship in Vietnam, and we go down that path a little bit. I don't want to give away too much of what we see in the movie, but was that something that warmed your heart, or that made you a little happy to know that maybe your brother wasn't in a different country all alone?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it makes me happy, and I think my siblings as well. I addressed this in the film, but I grew up. I mean, I came out in 1984, and so that was a scary time to come out with the AIDS crisis. And so, and when I look back at my life in my 20s, I think about what a sad and scary and lonely time it was to come out as a gay person. And then I think, even though HIV wasn't around, I think that the 60s and 70s weren't so good either for other reasons. At least in the 80s, there was a lot of encouragement for people to come out, and increasing acceptance. So I kind of came from this like post post gay liberation mindset, and he was more like from the preset. So it's interesting for me to kind of look and see what his life might have been like. But it's always a joy to me when people find their happiness, for sure.
The way that politics are changing in the US, that this story could be, set in the 60s or 70s, but this is also probably happening to families, right now too. As far as, kids not being able to feel like they can be themselves and be able to express themselves and love who they want, and, maybe have to move to another state or move somewhere far away. And it's hard to watch a documentary like this thinking like this is something in the past and look how far we've come along, when really, given a lot of things going on in the world, it doesn't necessarily feel that we've made as much progress as we would have liked.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We had our world premiere in London, which is a city that's country that's come a long way. They had kind of repressive laws, and now they're quite forward thinking. But our U.S. premiere was in Miami, and I've heard a lot of people say like, "Oh, why would you go to Florida?" I'm like, "Well, we have to. Like, we have to go all these places and share these stories." And really, it was very moving to have the U.S. premiere in Miami, because I had a set of friends, and they were able to bring their other friends, and other people from the community came in that sort of challenging and repressive environment down there. I think these are the stories that need to be told. And the other thing that's really nice about, once we get to the distribution part of the film, we don't have distribution yet. We're looking for distribution, so I'm throwing that out there. But once we get distribution, I've been told that it is sometimes possible to be featured on online streamers that may also project films into countries where homosexuality is illegal or where there's, issues with this, so that in a way to kind of get to the people in that country is, through film or through documentaries, through streaming can work.
Oh, well, best of luck. I hope that 100% happens for you to be able to share that, because there's going to be other people in other countries that don't necessarily feel seen. They're going to be able to with this film. A lot of families also have, whether they look at like a family photograph on a wall or through an album of someone that they rarely talk about, or someone that is,
Yeah.
rarely mentioned. And sometimes their stories get lost, and sometimes somebody may want to delve a little deeper. Maybe someone who may have struggled with wanting to know someone's story or a relative story a little bit more, about kind of handling that and making peace ultimately with, maybe the things you don't necessarily know.
Yeah, I've already had some friends approach me about some relatives of theirs whose stories kind of remains secret, and I've encouraged people to try to talk to older people before they pass away, try to get photos and letters and take video. I mean, I've even told people, if you have an inkling that you might want to make a documentary or even just document things, start taking footage, start filming, and when I started making this film, I told my family it was an oral history project, and I wasn't lying. I was just, at the time, I was like trying to take all this down. There was a point after a couple years where I had to kind of come clean that, yeah, I was planning on making a public documentary. I think it's really important for people to tell these stories.
Mhm. And then final thing here, how much of a healing process has this been for you, as far as creating the project, and now that audiences are getting to see it, and you're able to talk about your brother in maybe a different way than you were 12 years ago before you started?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question as well. I've always told people that my main motivation for making the film was to make a work of art, a good work of art, a cinematic, quality work film. But if as a secondary effect, it had a healing quality to me or my family or other people who watched it, that would be amazing. I will say that my family members are getting along. We're getting along better than we ever have, which I think is wonderful. I'm not saying it's because of this film, but I do think that once you kind of get into the mindset of telling the truth, it really helps with family dynamics, and it kind of clears the air. And certainly audiences have really reacted. I have a lot of people in tears, a lot of people reacting to connecting the film to various stories in their family or in their lives. So it's very moving to me.
That is wonderful. September 28th at the Reeling Film Festival is where you go ahead and check out the Chicagoland premiere of this movie. ReelingFilmFest.org is where you can go ahead and get all those tickets.
Yeah.
And Peter, you were in Chicago for almost a decade. I mean, you looking forward to seeing friends go in a particular neighborhood, particular restaurant when you're back here?
Yeah, I lived in Chicago actually 15 years. Lived there twice. The first time, I worked at the Chicago Cultural Center for the city of Chicago. So we're going to have a big reunion of former colleagues. And yeah, I love Chicago, and I'm happy to return. Two of my siblings who are in the film are going to come. My brother John and my sister Mary are going to come. And I also wanted to mention just that if people want to keep track of the journey of this film, the website for the film is jimmyandsaigon.com. And you can learn everything you want to know about the film, and even sign up for our newsletter, which tells people, where the film is going to be in other cities.